Page 147, continued. Number 2. His epigrams and aphorisms. His style is epigrammatic. It is quotable and can easily be memorized. Probably no poet, says Edmonds, with the exception of Shakespeare, has enriched our language so much with quotable and readily remembered sayings. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. To err is human, to forgive divine, are only two of his numerous aphorisms, coined with such final forces as to have the accent of proverbs. He says what he has to say in the fewest possible words. His diction is packed with thought. Number 3. Brilliance of his satires. Satirical poetry is not of the greatest, and the major part of satirical poetry is not of the greatest, and the major part of Pope's poetry is satirical. But as a satirist, he excels all other English poets. His careful workmanship often makes his satirical touches more attractive than Dryden's, says John Dennis. He has no superiors in the rapid rapier thrusts which confound and demolish an opponent. His satires shine with electric brilliance. None could excel him in his vivid portraits of the people he detested. There is no more consummate piece of satire than the 12 lines that contain the poet's masterpiece, the character of Atticus in the epistle of Dr. Arbuthnot. His satire often achieves universality when he is guided and inspired by his offended artistic conscience rather than by his personal hostilities. Number 4. Child of his age. Pope is the poet who represents best the early 18th century. Its literary merits and defects are alike conspicuous in his verse, and he stands immeasurably above the numerous versifiers who may be said to belong to his school. Pope was the child of his age. The literary characteristics of the age are emphasis on wit and good sense, a genius for satire, regard for correctness, and the avoidance of extremes. The poets are not inspired by passion or enthusiasm. Wit takes precedence over imagination. Nature is concealed by artifice. All these merits and demerits of the age are faithfully represented by the poetry of Pope. It was an age of prose and reason, and even the poetry of the age is prosaic. A hard intellectuality and a rationality, qualities proper to prose, mark the poetry of Pope. His themes too are prosaic: criticism, moral philosophy, and satire, which require critical analysis and discussion. He is the most correct of English poets. Indeed, as Johnson points out, Pope wrote for his age, and he exhibits extraordinary art in ministering to the tastes of the age. Its critical commonplaces are admirably summed up by him in his essay on criticism, and his essay on man summarizes the current ethical code. His satires throw a flood of light not only on the chances of the poetasters of Grub Street, but also on the decline of educational and literary standards, and on pedantry and corruption in high places. Leslie Stephen is therefore right when he says that no writer reflects so clearly and completely the spirit of his own days. It was a citified, C-I-T-I-F-I-E-D, citified age, and the writers of the period dealt exclusively with the life of the fashionable upper strata of London society. The fashions, the frivolities, the vanities, and the follies of this upper were strata are also faithfully represented by Pope in his poetry, and more especially in The Rape of the Lock. Pope's mock epic deals with town life and mirrors in its entirety the social life of the 18th century London, commenting on the rape of the lock as a mirror to the fashions and foibles of the age. J.R. Lowell writes, "It was a mirror in a drawing room, but it gave back a faithful image of society, powdered and rouged, to be sure, and intent on trifles, yet still as human in its own way as the heroes of Homer in theirs." However, it is to be noted that Pope describes only the life of the upper classes of the city of London. The life of the lower sections of society, like the dwellers in the countryside, shepherds, farmers, etc., is ignored. Even the life of the upper classes has been dealt with only superficially. He does not probe into the depths, does not portray the boredom from which the upper class suffered. Thirdly, life of the underworld has not been dealt with. There was much coarseness and brutality in the age, much vice and crime, but this has not been rendered by the poet. He deals only with the surface glitter and ignores the reality behind. End of page 147, now page 148. What is the heroic couplet? A heroic couplet is a group of two lines rhyming at the end, both the lines being iambic pentameters. Now, what is an iambic pentameter? A pentameter is a line consisting of 5 feet, and if every one of these 5 feet is an iamb or iambic foot, the line is an iambic pentameter. An iambic pentameter foot consists of 2 syllables, the first of which is unstressed and the second stressed. For instance, the word divide makes an iambic foot in verse, for its first syllable die is unstressed and the second wide is stressed. His use of the heroic couplet. The heroic couplet was first used by Chaucer with great mastery and skill. The Elizabethans too used it, but they used to like the loose verse, blank verse, with the sense running on from one couplet to another, and often till the very end of a paragraph. Dryden used it with great force, and he too retained much of the freedom and flexibility of the earlier masters. Pope, on the other hand, says Tillotson, regards the heroic couplet as if they were stanzas, self-contained. The chief characteristics of Pope's use of the couplet may be summed up as follows. A. His couplets are closed, that is to say, that sense does not run on from one couplet to another. The sense is complete or nearly complete with each couplet. Every couplet thus tends to become a unit by itself and can be taken out and enjoyed irrespective of its context. This makes his couplets rather rigid and flexible and wanting in the freedom and ease of Dryden. B. In each couplet, the caesura caesura, caesura or pause is placed exactly in the middle, after the fourth syllable and before the sixth. The caesura is not varied and this results in monotony. There is no splitting of couplets as in Dryden and others. Splitting means that the sense of any one of the two lines is linked up with the sense of the couplet which has preceded or which follows. Pope never splits his couplets. He makes each of them a separate unit by itself. D. At the end there is generally a single rhyme, that is, only one syllable of the last word of each of the two lines of a couplet rhymes. The use of double rhyme, that is, two syllables rhyming with each other, is rare with Pope. At the end there is generally a single line, that is, one syllable at the last word of each of the two lines of a couplet rhymes. The use of double rhyme, that is, two syllables rhyming with each other, is rare with Pope. E. His use of the heroic couplet is characterized by brevity and preciseness. His couplets are well polished, refined and correct. They have a rare brilliance. They are epigrammatic and easily memorable. As Swift puts it, Pope can fix in one couplet more sense than I can do in 6. Pope is matchless for condensation and concentration. Pope does not make use of Alexandrines, that is, lines of 12 syllables, and triplets, that is, 3 lines rhyming together, as was done by Dryden. There is no looseness. Each couplet stands by itself and is well balanced and compact. The verification of Pope has come in for a good deal of criticism, and he is never defended with great stability, by which writers like Edith Stilwell and Robert Bensley The versification of Pope has come in for a good deal of criticism, and he has been defended with great ability by writers like Edith Sitwell and Professor Bensley. The following are the main charges that have been levelled against Pope. A. Pope lacks variety, and so government grows monotonous. Pope lacks variety, and so grows monotonous. As the sense must end with each couplet, he has to narrow it down and confine it within these limits. B. The heroic couplet is exclusively the unit of composition. This results in discontinuity of thought. C. He lacked an ear for rhyme. There are a large number of unsatisfactory rhymes and frequent repetition of the same rhymes at close intervals, showing a poverty of vocabulary. D. His views about the uniformity of sense and sound are crude, and he could never equal the music and melody of great poets. Music which can be appreciated independent of the direct meaning of the word. In defense of Pope, such is the criticism of Pope as a metrist. Let us at once admit that some of Pope's rhymes are faulty, though in many cases the fault results from a change of pronunciation and is not real. It is also true that Pope cannot rival the homogeneousness of the greatest poets like Shelley and Coleridge, whom we can only enjoy for the music alone, irrespective of their sense. He was writing in an age of prose and reason, and for this prose and reason, his poetry is rational and intellectual, and so is it to be enjoyed primarily for its sense. It would be unfair to ask him for an bhul. It is also true, defense of Pope. Such is the criticism of Pope as a metrist. Let us at once admit that some of Pope's rhymes are faulty, though in many cases the fault rises from a change of pronunciation and is not real. It is also true that Pope cannot rival harmonies of the greatest poets like Shelley and Coleridge, whom we can enjoy for their music alone, irrespective of their sense. He was writing in an age of prose and reason. His poetry is rational and intellectual, and so be it to be enjoyed primarily for its sense. It would be unfair to ask him for the qualities of romantic poetry as to ask a portrait painter to paint a landscape. As far as the other two charges are concerned, a little examination should flow that money. As far as the other charges are concerned, a little examination would show that they are not tenable. Poets' couplets seem to be monotonous only to the careless reader, but careful examination reveals the minute variety and rapidity of its movements that he has imparted to his couplets with great skill. Variety is introduced first by the varying depth of the caesura. End of page 148, now page 149. Sometimes the pause is so shallow or slight that there seems to be no pause at all, and at other times it is quite weighty and deep. Page number 149 continued. Second, variety is introduced by accent variation. Normally, there should be only 5 accents, but in Pope's lines there are sometimes 4 and sometimes 6 accents, and that is why Pope has remained inimitable up to this day. He has left the stamp of his genius on the heroic couplet. Third, variety movement are introduced by the skillful manipulation of liquid consonants and alliteration. Miss Edith Sitwell studies the texture and not the structure of his couplets and concludes that variations in speed result from the fine texture of the couplets. For example, in the following lines from The Rape of the Lock: some to the sun their insect wings unfold, waft on the breeze or sings in clouds of gold. Transparent forms, too fine for mortal sight, their fluid bodies half dissolved in light. She finds a beautiful description of the poem. The brilliant variations and movements are hereby produced by the use of beautiful liquid sounds. In the Dunciad or Dunciad, a thick muffled doll and a thumping sound as thick as and gross as stupidity itself is produced by using the alliterating M. The mighty mother and her son who brings the Smithfield muses to the ears of kings. The charge that Pope made the couplet exclusively the unit of his composition and that this resulted in discontinuity of thought and disintegration can also not be maintained. The paragraph is the real unit of Pope, just as a prose writer expresses his thoughts in a number of separate sentences, but the thought runs over the paragraph and there is no discontinuity. So is the case with Pope. Separate couplets do not necessarily imply a break in thought. Moreover, continuity is imparted by extending alliteration over the boundaries of the couplet and by studying the music of the whole paragraph. In short, Pope's range may be limited to one measure, but he has handled it with rare brilliance and skill. Countless have tried to imitate him, but none has ever equalled him. He was a genius and he transformed what he touched. The history of the heroic couplet and some poems written in it. The heroic couplet was the first used by Chaucer, who adopted it perhaps from old French verse. Some of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, as also the prologue, are in couplets. At the end of the 16th century, Spenser, Marlowe and Shakespeare made various uses of the heroic couplet. Spenser's Mother Hubbard's Tale, 1597, is a satiric narrative in his heroic couplet. In Michael Drayton's England's heroical epistles again, we find the use of the couplet. The last two lines of every sonnet by Shakespeare constitute a heroic couplet. Some of these couplets look curiously like the couplets of Dryden and Pope. For instance, consider the following one. For we, which now behold these present days, have eyes to wonder, but lack tongues to praise. Edward Fairfax, in his translation of Tasso's Godfrey of Bouillon, used the same measure and was named by Dryden himself as one of the earliest reformers of English prosody. Prosody, prosody. The group of Elizabethan satirists, including Donne, Lodge, Hall and Marston, also had recourse to the couplet, but their couplets are uneven and rugged and flagrantly disdainful of its discipline. Sir John Beaumont wrote his Bosworth Field in couplets which are instinct with sweetness and have an even flow. Sir George Sandys used the heroic couplet in his Metamorphoses, but his couplets were neither pithy nor uniform. Incidentally, Sandys was praised by Dryden as the best verifier of the former age. Milton used heroic couplets for 4 of his Cambridge poems, but in their freedom they look more like rhymed blank verse. Edmund Walter was recognized by both Dryden and Pope as their master. Denham wrote his Cooper Hill in couplets which resemble Cleveland's Cleveland's poetical poems also use the heroic couplet. His couplets are not smooth, but they have the important quality of directness. With Dryden and Pope, we come to the real masters of the heroic couplet. They made the couplet regular and correct, and at the same time a very flexible and polished medium of poetic expression. Dryden wrote no fewer than 30,000 couplets. He used the couplet not only for his narrative and satiric poems like Absalom and Achitophel, the Medal, Macflecknoe, and the Hind and the Panther, but also for his heroic tragedies like Aurangzeb and the Conquest of Granada. Pope perfected the couplet. All his important poems like The Rape of the Lock, The Dunciad, Essay on Man and Essay on Criticism are in couplets. Pope's contemporaries like Addison, Prior, Gay, Swift and Ambrose Phillips also employed the heroic couplet for their numerous works. End of page 149, now page 150. After them, the most important and the weightiest wielder of the heroic couplet is Dr. Johnson, whose Vanity of Human Wishes is his greatest work. The vogue of the couplet declined after him as Romanticism spread in the air and poets started gradually turning away from the conventions of the neoclassical school of Dryden and Pope. However, off and on there did come poems in heroic couplets. Byron's English Bards and Scotch Reviewers 1809 is the most notable example. Byron was indeed the most classical of all Romantic poets. What is poetic diction? English neoclassical poets, like their French counterparts, were very particular about the division of poetry into various kinds of genres, such as elegy, the heroic poem, the satire, the epic, and so on. They upheld the principle of decorum, which demands that for every kind a particular style is needed and that there should not be any confusion of styles. Further, they drove a wedge between the language of prose and the language of serious poetry. For lower genres like satire, they did not mind using the language and idiom of prose, but for the elegy, the heroic poem, the epic, and such like genres, what they aimed at employing was a language as far removed from the lowly prose as possible. Obviously, in an epic, such words as pot, broom, or even door could not be used, as their presence would create a pathetic effect. Consequently, a special language of poetry was devised and later traditionalized by the practice of poet after poet. Consequently, a special language of poetry was devised and later traditionalized by the practice of poet after poet. This special language, somewhat stilted and artificial, ruled the roost for decades and was challenged only by Wordsworth at the end of the 18th century. In the preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, 1800, Wordsworth vehemently protested against what he called the gaudiness and inane phraseology of many modern writers. He further protested, "There will also be found in these volumes little of what is usually called poetic diction, as much pain has been taken to avoid it as is ordinarily taken to produce it." Wordsworth was against the very principle of the division of language into the language of prose and the language of poetry. He went so far as to assert that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Poetry sheds no tears, such as angels weep, but natural and human tears. She can boast of no celestial ichor that distinguishes her vital juices from those of prose. The same human blood circulates through the veins of both. Coleridge in Biographia Literaria controverted Wordsworth's point of view. He maintained that there ought to be some difference between the language of poetry and that of prose, and there should be some difference between the language of prose and that of actual conversation. I write, said Coleridge in Meter, because I am about to use a language different from that of prose. It may be pointed out here that Wordsworth did not only criticize the language diction used by many of his predecessors, but also their frequent indulgence. It may be pointed out here that Wordsworth did not only criticize the language diction used by many of his predecessors, but also their frequent indulgence in archaisms, archaisms, both of grammar and vocabulary, and various other poetic licenses pressed into service for poetizing their language and consequently removing it as far from language of prose as possible. Robert Bridges, in his essay Poetic Diction in English in Collected Essays, observes, "The revolt against the old diction is a reaction which, in its general attitude, is rational, and it is in line with the reaction of the Lake School of Poetry, familiar to all students in Wordsworth's statement and Coleridge's criticism and correction of that statement in his Biographia Literaria. Both movements alike protest against all archaisms of vocabulary and grammar and what are called literary forms, and plead for the simple term and direct forms of common speech."